Thanks very much, and I'm really happy to be invited to this event. I think it's a great idea. So we're going to move from more conceptual thinking. I was thinking about natural scientists when I put this presentation together, so it's more of a snapshot of the research I've been involved with for the last 12 years, with more of an empirical focus, I will admit, but there are social science and these ideas embedded in the research I'm going to present today. So this is one of my collaborators, and it'll give you a signal to the kind of research I'm going to present, which is pretty applied and collaborative. And I'm following the sort of overarching questions that we are asked to talk about. What are some of the core questions that motivate my research? What are the core research methods that I use? And what are some interesting research findings? And then where do I think I'm heading with this research? And hopefully lots of time for questions. So I have divided into three the core questions that I think motivate my research. And the first one is trying to understand, almost all my research is based in Southern Africa, really almost all in Malawi in Southern Africa. And part of what I try to do is understand what are some of the historical and political and social factors that have helped to foster particular agricultural practices in that place. And so I have done some historical research looking at different colonial policies and post-colonial policies that foster production of particular crops, but also ideas about those crops, and different policies that discourage or encourage particular farming practices. The bulk of what I'm going to be presenting about today is focused on the second and third questions, which are, what are the sustainable agricultural practices that are feasible under smallholder farmer conditions in Southern Africa, resource-poor conditions, in the face of climate change, but also in the face of other vulnerabilities and other changing conditions for smallholder farmers in that place. And then related to that, I'm really interested in the approach that best works to try to find new approaches to farming in Malawi and elsewhere. So how can we work together alongside farming communities to improve food security, health, nutrition, and social equality or social equity concerns? So some broad scoping themes that I look at when thinking about these questions. There's a dominant agricultural focus that is promoted in Africa, and it is focused on a kind of productionist vision of agriculture. So very input intensive, reliance on fertilizer, reliance on herbicides, reliance on hybrid seeds, and technologically oriented with an emphasis on monoculture cropping and linking smallholder farmers in Africa to global markets. That's the dominant way that agriculture is promoted for the future in Malawi and elsewhere in Africa. And the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which is a recent initiative spearheaded by the Gates Foundation, among others, is an example of that kind of approach. Sort of contrasting alternative approach that I'm interested in doing research on and also trying to understand if that's feasible under smallholder conditions is one that's more holistic and takes into account social and nutritional factors, and also it pays attention to farmer knowledge, local knowledge, and empowerment of farmers in utilizing different approaches. And so some of my writing has been focused on contrasting these and also paying attention to local ideas about agricultural approaches. Another empirical reality that influences my research focus is that of what is predicted for sub-Saharan Africa in general with regards to climate change, and that is increase in drought intensity, increase in frequency in droughts, as well as reduced precipitation in general, alongside flooding when there is precipitation. And given that Africa is probably one of the least responsible parts of the world for greenhouse gas emissions, there's questions around social equality, questions around justice, as well as questions around how rural communities are going to deal with those predictions in the future. So some of the core research methods that I use a combination of mixed methods. First of all, very collaborative. I work with a lot of natural scientists and nutritionists, and I also do a lot of work alongside farmers and alongside sort of non-governmental organizations and hospital staff. And so participatory research as well as collaborative in the sense of across disciplines as well as with local communities. And my own research methods are a combination of qualitative methods, so in-depth interviews, survey work, some drawing on agricultural data such as yield data, also using nutritional data such as child growth data, and some visual methods as well as some archival research. And so most of my research is very applied, and I'm also interested in understanding multiple ways of looking at a problem, so multiple ways of knowing and understanding a problem across different scales, both historical and across different places. So as I mentioned, most of my research is focused in this little country in southern Africa called Malawi. And it's an interesting case study. It's for looking at questions of, how might we produce food more sustainably in the current period and in the future, because it's a place that is, first of all, very poor. It's one of the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a country highly dependent on agriculture. If Rich were here, he might see this as a resource-dependent country. About 85% of the country relies directly on agriculture for their livelihood and also for their food production. And it is a place, you can see this is the dominant crop of the country, corn or maize, which makes up over 60% of land area, but also makes up the majority of the diet of Malawians. And so it's an interesting place to think about questions of sustainability in that context. Interestingly, from this contrasting approach to addressing food security and to addressing agriculture, Malawi is also a place where the kind of input-intensive approach has really been heavily promoted in the last 5 years, but you might say historically, really for the last 30 years, in that there's been a fertilizer subsidy and hybrid seed subsidy in place that has heavily promoted reliance on these imported inputs, and it has for a while been touted as a Malawi miracle that has solved hunger, although more recent evidence is that it hasn't addressed hunger and malnutrition substantively, very effectively. The current statistics suggest that about 40% to 50% of households are still running out of their own food stocks and experiencing daily food insecurity on an annual basis. And child stunting rates, so a good measure of malnutrition of children, still hovers at about 50% of under 5 children. And so that's one of the reasons why you might think that this is an interesting place to think about questions of sustainability. So as I mentioned, I've been involved in a sort of long-term participatory and collaborative research project. And that project has been based in northern Malawi in a place called Ekwendeni. And we've been doing experiments with farmers in the area on different diversification options, not economic diversification, as Rich was talking about, but in this case, biological diversification. And that diversification includes this system that is depicted here, which is growing pigeon pea, which is a kind of tall shrub that has deeper roots, and you can use it for forage, for livestock, you can use it for fuel wood, and you can also harvest the pea, and thus the name pigeon pea. But it's a nitrogen-fixing crop, which means it draws nitrogen from the atmosphere. And alongside it, in this same picture, is peanut or groundnut, which is also a nitrogen-fixing crop, but also produces an edible legume. And farmers, this is just one option that farmers were experimenting with. Farmers have also been experimenting with a number of different legume options, some which have greater amounts of nitrogen contribution from nitrogen fixation and some which have lesser amounts and which have other benefits for farmers. And the idea was to take a participatory approach with farmers, so providing a sort of basket of options that they can try out on their own farms. And they take those options and try them out on their own farms and test which works under their farming conditions, and we measure changes over time to see if we see improvements in food security, soil fertility, and child nutrition. But we also get their perspectives on these different technology options. And it's really been a sort of farmer-to-farmer teaching approach. So each community that got involved had members of the community who became part of a farmer research team. And that farmer research team learned about different options, and they managed village plots that demonstrated all the different options that farmers could choose from. And then we developed different sort of educational approaches for teaching other communities about what they were learning. And those educational approaches changed over time. So everything from sort of recipe days to farmer-to-farmer apprenticeship programs to field days. And it was sort of an iterative process where we were learning, developing research findings, and then changing our approach based on what we were finding out. So some of our findings that we've generated, and really almost all of this is we, not I, as you'll see from the publications listed on the different pages. But the first thing we learned is that farmers are interested in these legume diversification options, which is in contrast to the kind of general discourse around Malawi, which is, maize is life, that Malawians aren't interested in having more diverse cropping systems. But what we found is using this approach, they are interested in expanding the amount of area devoted to other crops. And we found that to be a consistent pattern over time, and it varied depending on which option they chose, how much area they devoted, but also whether they were female-headed household, whether their level of poverty affected which things they wanted to test out. Now, if you want these legume diversification options to lead to improvements in soil fertility, one thing that would be good to do as a farmer would be to bury the residue after you've harvested the legume grain in order to have it decompose and become available for whether it be maize or another crop the following year. And initially we weren't seeing very high levels of farmers who were burying the crop residue after harvest. And so some of our research has been looking at what are some of the social factors at work that are preventing farmers from choosing to do that. And there were a number of different factors at work, both at the household and community level. One thing that was happening was there aren't many people in a given community who have livestock, but those who do tend to be better off and often are village leaders. And pigeon pea is a forage. And so the village leaders saw a great opportunity for their cattle and goats to graze on people's pigeon pea. And people didn't feel comfortable saying to their village headman, could you leave my pigeon pea alone because I want to bury it for my crop next year. And so after discussions with farmers about this problem, we organized, and this was at the suggestion of the farmer research team, we organized livestock, I can't remember the English translation, but essentially like a livestock awareness meeting where we would give a gift of pigeon pea to the headman and sort of implore him socially to protect the pigeon pea fields for his community, and it was usually a man, for his community for future generations. And so to sort of put social pressure on him, but also a little bit of an enticement to see this as an opportunity for him to improve his soils as well. Another strategy that was employed, because we also found that the task of burying crop residue was more often done by men very close to planting season, or they would burn the crop. And women typically did the legume harvests. And so by asking people to bury the crop residue early, we were essentially trying to change the division of labor within the household, and women didn't feel comfortable going back to their husband and saying, do you mind burying the crop residue? But they also had too much work to do at the household level to do it themselves. And so the farmer research team organized these village crop residue promotion days where they would go to a village plot and they say, come on men, we are burying our fertilizer. This is something you should do. This is a manly task. This is something that you should take on. And what we've been able to demonstrate is a very dramatic shift in legume residue incorporation over time. This is just from 1 year, but we've been able to show a significant difference over time and compared to households not involved in the project in terms of this agricultural practice. So we've taken some of our findings over a longer period of time, and in collaboration with some natural scientists at Michigan State University and the University of Malawi, we've been able to show that this increase in biodiversity has multiple impacts. It reduces the amount of soil erosion happening, it increases the nutritional benefits, so the protein yield, it reduces the overall value-cost ratio. The overall cost goes down because you don't have to spend as much money on fertilizer. Your fertilizer efficiency, if you have access to fertilizer, increases because your soil quality is improved. And you have the same amount of yield as you would if you were just growing maize monocrop. So these are exciting impacts that we think from simply increasing the number of crops by 1 or 2 additional crops. And we've also been able to explore what farmers think of the different educational strategies we've been using. And they feel that these educational strategies, which rely more on sort of discussion groups and farmer-to-farmer exchanges, are really great ways for them to learn new ideas, and that they rarely in the past have had this opportunity to kind of sit down and have intergenerational and across-gender discussions about, different strategies for addressing their lives. And using anthropometric data, we've been able to demonstrate that this combination of kind of a farmer-to-farmer educational approach combined with legume diversification has had significant impacts on child growth. This is weight for age, but we've also been able to show it in terms of height. And so this is very exciting because actually there isn't a lot of evidence out there that an agricultural intervention can have impacts on nutritional status. So moving right along, I'm looking at my clock here, and that's one component of our research. I've also been doing research for the last 3 years on climate change perceptions and adaptation strategies in the same communities in the north as well as some communities in central Malawi. And we've looked initially at what do people think is happening to the climate, and people's perceptions are that they're getting a reduction in the total rainfall as well as a reduction in the rainfall, the rainy season. And we didn't find any differences in terms of gender or other socioeconomic status in terms of that perception. But we were also interested in where people were getting their information about farming and about climate change, and we have found significant differences in terms of gender for agricultural information, with women getting more of their information from their neighbors and their friends and their kin, and men getting more information from agricultural extension workers. So that was a snapshot. In addition to looking at people's perceptions about climate change, we've been interested in what are some of the changing cropping patterns. And one of the things we've learned is that there is an indigenous grain called sorghum, which used to be widely grown in northern Malawi and has largely disappeared from the landscape. So a survey we did a couple of years ago showed only about 2% of farmers grew it now, even though 2 or 3 generations ago, most farmers grew it as a backup crop. It's more drought tolerant than maize, and it was considered to be good to grow in addition to maize to make sure that if the maize failed, you had something for your staple food. And nowadays, very, very few farmers even knew that it could be eaten. At the same time, another indigenous grain, finger millet, despite the colonial and post-colonial governments actively discouraging the production of finger millet, has been persistently grown by farmers who use it largely for the production of beer. And it's a crop that you can also use as a staple food. It is also more drought tolerant than maize. And women are largely responsible for the production and the production of beer and the gaining of income from that beer. But we were able to track a decline of finger millet in the contemporary period, which we've argued is partially related to an increase in tobacco production. So coming out of this research, we are arguing that indigenous knowledge is dynamic, and it shifts. It not only shifts in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of the implications for agrobiodiversity and for sustainability in light of climate change, and that we need to pay attention to gender relations at the household level, to environmental interactions with household and community relations, as well as agricultural policies that discourage or encourage different crops at different time periods. Okay, so I have a few minutes to talk about current and future research projects, and I'm going to walk you through 4 sort of current or about to start research projects that I'm involved with. And the first one is building on this work that we've done on climate change perceptions and kind of changing cropping patterns, and that is participatory research on climate change adaptation. And this is in collaboration with the hospital, the University of Malawi, and with 400 households who have selected different strategies to test in terms of climate change adaptation. And we're tracking change over time in terms of food security and dietary diversity, but we're also interested in their kind of knowledge and understanding of what is happening in their households and in their communities. And a portion of that research is really focused on AIDS-affected households. About a quarter of all the households who are doing these participatory experiments have someone in their household who's HIV positive, because we want to understand what their particular constraints and challenges are, both socially and in other dimensions, to make sure that we pay attention to this group of farmers. HIV prevalence rate is about 11% in Malawi, so it's very much a major challenge that many households are struggling with. So a second project that is just launching this year is something called the Malawi Farmer-to-Farmer Agroecology project. And this is basically building on the work that we've done for the last decade by trying to see if we can use this more agroecological approach, or this agricultural diversification, whether we can use this strategy as a means to improve food security, nutrition, and also social equality by using a sort of farmer-to-farmer teaching approach. And we're working in northern and central Malawi, and we're going to be involving 2,000 new farmers a year, but using this very heavily focused farmer-to-farmer teaching strategy. And we hope to measure changes both qualitatively and quantitatively over time in the different communities that we're working in. So a broader research project that is really kind of just getting off the ground is trying to compare these contrasting approaches of agroecological approaches versus this more kind of green revolution approach, and looking at these approaches critically from multiple disciplines, so historians, geographers, sociologists, natural scientists in different sites across Africa. And my research would kind of fit into this broader research project that we're hoping to undertake, or we're just getting started in undertaking, and trying to understand the implications of these contrasting approaches in different places in Africa. And then a last project that is also just getting started this year, and is in collaboration with Dr. Sarah Young, is a pilot project that is trying to explore the social and nutritional factors that might foster improve food security and nutrition in southwest Tanzania, which is a semi-arid area, and look at the potential for different participatory and agroecological approaches to improving food security and nutrition in that place. And this project is really at the inception stages. Initially, the focus is on cowpea, which is a legume. It's a native legume to Africa that is very drought tolerant, and there's been previous research done on cowpea in Tanzania, but we intend to include the broader farming system. So to conclude, the key findings from my long-term research has been that agrobiodiversity is one strategy that can be quite effective in addressing food security, improved land quality and nutrition in sub-Saharan Africa, but the approach to how that strategy is promoted and tested is as important as the actual agrobiodiversity strategy itself. So an emphasis on kind of co-learning and adaptation alongside farmers, and also paying attention to the social inequalities at the household level, at the community level, and even the sort of researcher-farmer interactions is important. So recognizing and addressing inequalities at multiple scales, as well as paying attention to broader social, political, and historical factors that influence agricultural practices at different places and different times. So I'm just going to acknowledge the slide with the different collaborators I work with at different universities and places in in Malawi, and to note that this work's been funded by a number of different funding organizations. So I look forward to your questions. I have 6 minutes for your questions according to this.